So welcome to this Dharma talk this evening, everyone. And I've called this talk The Deepest Peace, being equally near to all things. And yeah, I mean, we're living in such interesting times, aren't we? It's yeah, there's a lot of tumultuous events happening all around us all the time. And really, there's so much, I think, at the moment in our collective experience right now that can so easily trigger contraction and aversion, turning away. And I know that many of us are experiencing quite a lot of helplessness or sense of helplessness or fear at the moment. And also individually, our daily lives are also filled with so many moments in each day, I think, in which our hearts can easily, just take flight. And we find ourselves ungrounded and blown off center. And I know that in my own life, I've been staying with family this last week in Tassie, as Hart said, and I've been reminded on more than a few occasions of the saying, if you think you're equanimous, stay with your family for a week. And this has all brought to mind for me this week the profound teaching of equanimity and what it has to teach us about how to live our lives well and keep moving towards the end goal of our Dharma practice, which is nibbana or liberation. Can everybody hear me okay? Thank you. So I was watching the news a couple of nights ago here in Tassie, which is something I don't do at home. And as soon as a story about the current Yemen Red Sea conflict started, I felt my body contracting, this visceral bracing against what was to come in this story. I felt my heart drop and my mind became quite numb to what was being said. And I felt this strong urge to turn away, to not see the destruction, to not hear about the tragedy, the pain that's happening there and in Gaza and elsewhere in the Middle East. The urge to get up and walk away was strong. And this, of course, is one choice available to us in such moments when we're confronted with such information. And I think it's really good to remember to take great care with what we consume on all levels, not least, what we take in from the media. And then another situation this week, which is closer to home, I guess, or much closer to home, I felt, a lot of helplessness and aversion on seeing a close family member, her health in decline. And, watching the slow disappearance of someone dear to me is really painful. And I've experienced a lot of moments of fear and deep sadness, really feeling the poignancy of the fleeting nature of life and recognizing that I can't predict or control the decline of this person's health or my own or others' aging, sickness, and eventual death. And it's in such moments, though, that we recognize our deep vulnerability as humans and how easily our hearts quiver and how easily we can tune out and turn away from meeting what's here in front of us. So I guess the question, to launch into this talk tonight is around how do we stay connected and present in the face of, such turmoil, in such evocative times as this, and in such such moments as I've just described. We all have them in different circumstances. How do we stay connected and present without losing heart, without falling into despair and overwhelm? How do we bear witness to the difficult, the confronting, without turning away, but to maintain this wisdom of seeing clearly, and importantly, to allow ourselves to feel the reality of life as it keeps unfolding. And I think we were practicing with this just before this talk. And I think this is where the practice of equanimity can provide such deep refuge. It's like this resting place that allows us to keep meeting life with a soft, open heart, and at the same time a really, I'd say, like a stable, strong spine. And equanimity in this way is an invitation to abide in peace in the midst of agitation, abide in mental balance in the midst of chaos or conflict. So, as many of you know, the equanimity is the last of the 4 Brahma Viharas, or divine abodes. These beautiful heart qualities, and it's also the last of the 7 awakening factors. And in both dimensions, equanimity is revealed in the mature heart and mind as the deepest peace. And one image that expresses this peace and is often used to describe equanimity is a cool, still, clear body of water that reflects all within its surface without preference. And another beautiful image is that of the full moon reflecting the light of the sun in a vast cloudless night sky. So in its dimension as one of the expressions of love, as one of the heart qualities, equanimity has this cool flavor. It's there to really balance the warmth of loving kindness and compassion and joy, which are the other Brahma Viharas, which are all expressed through images of the sun itself. So this is not to say, though, when we talk about equanimity being cool, this is not to say that it's detached or indifferent. And indifference is actually equanimity's near enemy. So sometimes it's very difficult to know or to discern the difference between indifference and equanimity. But rather, equanimity, it's a fluid and responsive way of engaging with life that is actually imbued with loving kindness, with compassion, and with joy. So with all the other Brahma Viharas. And in its mature expression, equanimity holds everything else. So it's like this vast container that can hold everything else. And I find the etymology of the Pali word for equanimity, which is upekkha, it really highlights this holding factor or quality. So upekkha is usually translated as equanimity, but it's also sometimes rendered as non-attachment or non-discrimination or impartiality. And the prefix upa means over or all around. And the root is ik. So upekkha, ik, is the root of eka, means to look or to see. So we might say then that this is the heart and the mind that is able to oversee or keep a wide open view of everything. So it's much like the view we might get from the summit of a mountain, for example. But this isn't a distant or detached view. It actually leaves nothing out, this view. And it can be very intimate. Well, I would say it is very intimate. And one teacher, I'm not sure who said this, I think it was a Zen teacher, described it as being equally near to all things, which I think is a really beautiful expression and a really evocative description of equanimity, equally near to all things. So we can see from that expression there's no distance or detachment there. So this week, for example, while I was watching the news, I was able to, once I became aware of my, this initial reactivity that I felt arising to the images and the words that I was hearing, turn towards mindfulness. And Bhikkhu Analayo refers to mindfulness as our good friend sati, and I think this is such a lovely way to think about mindfulness, that our good friend is always there, just here, if we're ready to turn towards our friend sati. So I turned towards mindfulness and recognized that I could simply hold in awareness all that was coursing through me right then. And so there was a real intimacy and aliveness all of a sudden. So just like the image of the full moon in a clear night sky, that awareness was able to reflect what was happening in my body and my heart and mind in those moments. And then I could just stay, as uncomfortable as it still was, with that vulnerability of really not wanting to look at what was happening, to stay with that vulnerability without getting involved. And then there was relief and an ability to just take it all in, to just be with it all. Yeah. Is this making sense? So, the late great Zen master Thich Nhat Hanh referred to this aspect of equanimity as inclusiveness. This ability to include all perspectives without taking sides, and while standing firmly at the center of everything. And we can experience this internally, as I did while watching the news that night, or we can experience it externally in our relationships, and we can see it in other beings. And Thich Nhat Hanh also says, equanimity is not indifference or coldness. It doesn't mean you don't love all your children. It means you love all of your children, we might say here, all beings. It means you love all beings without discrimination. So the wide open heart, in its I was going to say state of equanimity, but equanimity is not a state, it's a way of being. So in the way of being in equanimity, the wide open heart doesn't limit love for just some beings and not others, but it includes all beings within this sphere of love without preference. Yeah. But of course, our tendency is to reserve our love. We call it, I love you, for example, is a very common expression. So often we think of love as, this thing that is ours that I have for somebody else. And we tend to reserve our love for very few people in our lives, and generally we can ignore most other beings, or at least we place them outside this inner circle. And of course, this doesn't mean that we don't love and deeply care for those closest to us. But it just means that when we can free the heart from its conceptual bounds, our stories and thoughts about, what love means and what is included and what's not, and all of the complexity of the stories we build through these conceptual bounds, then we can include more and more beings into this sphere of care, and then love can flow freely through us and be available to all. So in this sense, we say that, love isn't mine, it doesn't belong to me, but it's the generous expression of an unbounded heart and mind that doesn't cling to anything whatsoever as me or mine, as the Satipatthana Sutta says. And then when we're faced with global current affairs, or dealing with a difficult personal situation, of course, it's tempting to look for someone to blame, to point the finger at, to justify our right view by making theirs wrong. And we can see this, happening in the media all the time and on social media. And this also doesn't mean that we don't take a stand when we see injustice or harmful behavior being carried out. But it means that we can be watchful for when we get caught up in what are called in the teachings the 8 worldly winds: gain and loss, praise and blame, fame and disrepute, and pleasure and pain. All these ways that we get tossed about in the world by our wanting to be life a certain way, or wanting to life not to be a certain way. And in this getting tossed about, we're always looking for a distinction in order to pit or compare me against you, us against them, mine against yours, or even me saving you. I came across a lovely story which expresses the futility of this, by Kyra Jewel. Sorry, I'll start that again. Kyra Jewel Lingo. She's a Zen teacher in the Thich Nhat Hanh or the Plum Village tradition, and she tells the following story. I once saw a cartoon of the word us in big bubble letters, and inside, in very tiny letters, hundreds of times, was the word them. Who is us? Who is them? Us is them. Them is us. So when we get caught up in clinging, and clinging is the far enemy of equanimity, when we get caught up in clinging and our stories about how I am and how the world is or should be or shouldn't be, we actually lose sight of this wide open view that equanimity offers. Yeah, that there is no separation between us. There's no us and them. There's just us. But when we get caught up in the clinging in our stories, our hearts shrivel and disconnect in our contraction, and our minds close tight around what we believe about the world, what we believe about ourselves and others. And in this state of clinging, it's difficult, or probably even impossible, I would say, to be compassionate, loving, and to rejoice in life, these beautiful qualities of the heart. But it only takes a tiny shift of attention, as I've just discovered this week in these 2 examples I gave you, a tiny shift of attention for our experience to be transformed. If we can let go of this habit of separation that we engage in by opening to what's actually here, just as we were practicing together this evening, to meet fully what's in front of us right here, just as we find it. I find that such a powerful expression, just as we find it. Then the qualities of equanimity can be revealed to us. There's I in my own experience, it's always the case that if I turn to what's already here and acknowledge that fact, then the heart can be softer and fuller immediately. Maybe only by a tiny fraction, but there's some opening, there's a crack there that happens. The mind can open, and then there's less drive for for life to be a certain way. We're less driven by wanting an aversion. And then what naturally happens is that we can be grounded in this wiser, more open view, this vaster view that equanimity offers us. So I had an experience of this softening this week as my mother and I walked together around her magnificent garden, which is just outside here. And I felt all the holding, the anxiety, and the fears for her future that I'd been grappling with for several days just melt away in these moments of just being with this beautiful flower right in front of us, just walking on this grass and listening to this bird or pulling these weeds. It was remarkable to me how vividly tender it was in that moment, that all of those stories, all of that wanting and aversion dropped away, and I could feel that wide open view holding me once again with no expectations. It was just presence and this calm abiding in my heart again. And of course, it didn't last because, the stories arose again. And yet, the more we build this muscle of awareness and we allow ourselves to drop into that calm abiding, the more it's likely to arise again. We're creating the conditions for the next moment's opening. So is it possible then to, rather than making these distinctions in any moment, i.e. taking sides, believing our stories, trying to control what's present, but rather to open to this reality of the endless flow of conditions that arise and fall over and over, resulting in what we see right here before us? Is it possible to recognize the absolute vulnerability of the human heart within, this Zen saying, the 10,000 joys and the 10,000 sorrows, all that life throws at us? And the reality of it all is impermanent and unreliable and unpredictable and not about me. Can we rest into that? Can we stand at the center of this life, warts and all, peace or no peace, knowing our vulnerability, knowing our interconnectedness with it all, without losing heart? Without losing heart, but rather I'd say to have our hearts broken open, actually, because this is what acknowledgement of our, universal human suffering does. It breaks our hearts open by what we're part of, by the recognition of what we're part of. And then when our hearts are broken open in that way, and we can sit in the center of all that we're part of, in this calm abiding, then we can allow our hearts to respond wisely. We can act with deep care, and we can act without entanglement. So this relates to another dimension of equanimity, which is the face of equanimity described by Bhikkhu Bodhi as there in the middleness. So there's this wide open view and the calm abiding of the heart qualities of equanimity. And then there's this wisdom aspect of equanimity, which expresses an unshakable balance of mind, which is unreactive in the face of wanting, aversion, and confusion, that sees clearly what is happening but doesn't get entangled. So in this sense, it receives all and it can let go of everything. And the Buddha says in the Jata Sutta, and this is just a part of the sutta and a section of this beautiful verse in the Jata Sutta. The Buddha is saying, a person established in virtue, developing discernment and mindfulness, ardent and clear, they can untangle this tangle. Those whose passion, aversion, and ignorance have faded away, for them the tangle is untangled. And so as we look at and participate in this tangle of the world in all its complexities, the crisis of climate change, the effects of human consumption, and the devastations that the ideologies and beliefs that we hold, and we see globally in so many different versions, visit on individuals and communities and ecosystems, and the growing breakdown in our modern systems, and even our own personal relationships, our familial and intimate relationships, and our community relationships. There's a lot of complexity there. But the Dharma, our mindfulness and wisdom practice, it's such a refuge for us. And as the Buddha said, it can allow us to untangle the tangle by simply bringing mindfulness to whatever is arising. So we practice equanimity actually through our continued cultivation of this mindfulness practice. We get to know passion and aversion and confusion or ignorance intimately. And we start to learn how they show up in our reactivity to life. And then also in our practice, we should also notice and savor those moments of calm abiding and non-clinging when they're present, and really allow them into our hearts and minds. Really get to know them, familiarize ourselves with them, because these moments are what can really nourish and nurture a softer and more open heart and mind. And also they give such nourishment to the continuity of our practice. When we're feeling like life is overwhelming and we can't practice, if we have those moments to draw on, there's so much more resilience there. And so then, this mental stability, which actually is one of the characters of equanimity, mental stability, it develops over time as we become more grounded in mindfulness. And this allows us to stay with whatever arises in awareness, as we've been speaking about and experiencing this evening, regardless of whether it's pleasant or unpleasant. The mind can remain increasingly unreactive, increasingly with whatever is here, and becomes superbly balanced and cool and at peace. And so this peace is actually based on this deepening understanding that comes with our continued practice, that life isn't personal, that it's not ultimately controllable or predictable, but instead it's the wondrous and mysterious unfolding of myriad causes and conditions that don't have a beginning or end. And then we can see life from a multiplicity of perspectives, like being on the summit of the mountain, or being this cool, still, clear lake, or the full moon on a clear, cloudless night, without getting caught up in any of them, in any of these perspectives. And we're able to let go of them all. And so I'd just like to finish with this another beautiful verse from the Dhammapada. And the Buddha says, "As a solid mass of rock is not stirred by the wind, so a sage is not moved by praise and blame. As a deep lake is clear and undisturbed, so a sage becomes clear upon hearing the Dhamma. Virtuous people always let go. They don't prattle about pleasures and desires. Touched by happiness and then by suffering, the sage shows no sign of being elated or depressed." So thank you for listening this evening. Thank you for your kind ears. So let's just sit together for 1 minute. And Heart, maybe if you could just ring the bell again in 1 minute. And let's just sit together quietly, and then we'll have some time for question and answers, discussion. letting these words wash over you, settle in your heart, in your mind and body.